In the spring of 1909, a story ran on the front page of a Phoenix newspaper that by every rule of the time should never have existed. It described a vast underground city carved into the rock deep beneath the walls of the Grand Canyon. Egyptian relics, rows of hieroglyphs no one could read, hundreds of chambers cut by hand into solid stone, a mile down in the dark, far below the Arizona desert. The men who said they found it claimed to work for the Smithsonian Institution. And then, within a matter of weeks, every trace of the discovery simply vanished. The explorer dropped out of the record. The professor leading the dig was never heard from again. The chambers were never opened to the public, never photographed, never confirmed. And the one group of people who had lived beside those mesas for 1,000 years, the Hopi, said almost nothing at all. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. For generations, their elders had spoken of an underworld beneath the canyon, a place their ancestors had climbed up from at the very beginning of the world. But when outsiders came asking about the caverns, asking what was really down there in the dark, the elders went quiet. They would tell you the old stories, the safe ones, the ones meant for children. They would not tell you the rest. There was a line in the conversation, and when you reached it, the talking stopped. This is the story of what they refused to say, and it is the story of why a forgotten article from 1909, dismissed by historians as a hoax for over a century, may turn out to be one of the last surviving clues to a civilization that the official record insists never existed at all. To understand why this story matters, you have to start with the canyon itself, and the people who were there long before any surveyor or newspaperman ever arrived. The Hopi did not see the Grand Canyon the way a tourist sees it. To them it was not scenery, it was the doorway. In their oldest accounts, humanity did not begin on the surface of the earth at all. It began below it, in earlier worlds stacked beneath this one, worlds that were each entered and then abandoned when the people living there grew corrupt and forgot themselves. According to the tradition, the ancestors climbed up through the worlds, one after another, until they emerged at last into this one through an opening in the ground. The Hopi call that place of emergence the Sipapu, and they place it down inside the canyon, near the river in the deep stone where almost no one goes. Now sit with that for a second, because it is easy to skip past. A people who have lived on those mesas for centuries are telling you plainly that their ancestors came up out of the earth through a hole in the canyon floor. That underground was not a metaphor, that there were structures, levels, a whole inhabited world below the surface, and that something happened down there that ended it. A flood, in some tellings, a purification, a world wiped clean so the next one could begin. And the tradition does not describe just one world below. It describes a sequence of them, each one entered, lived in, and then lost. The first world, in the oldest accounts, ended in fire. The second froze over and was buried under ice. The third is the one that matters here, because in that telling the people had grown clever. They had built cities. They had learned to cross great distances, in some versions through the air, in shields or craft of some kind. They had power and wealth and reach, and they used all of it to turn on one another until the world was so far gone that it had to be drowned. Only a handful were judged worthy to be carried through to the next world's car, sealed away and protected while the waters did their work, then guided up into the clean world above. That is the emergence. That is the Sipapu. Now notice what the story is actually describing underneath the poetry. An advanced people, a catastrophe by water, a small remnant preserved underground behind a sealed door, then brought up into a fresh world to start over with the lesson burned into them. The Hopi were not telling a bedtime story about where the first people came from. They were keeping a record of a fall. For a long time, the academic world filed all of this under mythology and moved on. Charming, symbolic, not literal. But here is where the story turns, because in 1909 a man walked into the offices of the Arizona Gazette claiming he had been down there, and he claimed it was not empty. His name, according to the paper, was G.E. Kincaid. The article described him as an explorer and a man of some experience, a hardened type who had spent years working through the back country of the Southwest. The story laid it out in detail. While travelling down the Colorado River, Kincaid said he had noticed something odd in the rock face, high up, hard to reach, stains on the stone, cut marks where there should have been none. He climbed up, and behind a screen of rock he found an opening, a passage, not a natural cave, but a tunnel, driven straight back into the cliff with a flat floor and even walls, the kind of work that does not happen by accident. And that passage, the article said, ran back nearly a mile into the mountain. Inside, Kincaid described a main corridor lined with side chambers, hundreds of them, branching off like the spokes of a wheel. Rooms large enough to hold tens of thousands of people, a great central chamber, storage halls, and in those rooms the things that should not have been there. Copper instruments hardened to an edge like steel, by a process no one in 1909 could reproduce, vases and urns of unknown metal, statues seated cross-legged in a way that looked, to his eye, distinctly Asian, grey seed and broken pottery, and on the walls, carvings, symbols, tablets covered in writing that nobody present could read, but which looked, the article insisted, like a mix of Egyptian and something older still. There was even, the paper reported, a chamber the explorers refused to fully enter, a crypt. Tiers cut into the stone, and on them the dead, bodies wrapped and laid in rows, each one with a tablet at its side, like the names had mattered to someone once. The article went further than most people remember, because most people only ever hear the short version. It described a central shrine at the heart of the main corridor, and in it an idol, a seated figure with its arms raised that Kincaid compared to images of Buddha. Around it smaller figures, and the walls behind it worked with carving. It described a hall it called the granary, with grey seeds still resting in it after who knows how long. It described tools and weapons of copper worked to a hardness the explorers could not account for, alongside what looked like the remains of mills and looms, the equipment of a whole working society, and not just a place to bury the dead. It described those tablets covered in a script that matched no living alphabet, set carefully beside each wrapped body as if the name had to travel with it. And it described one chamber the men would not enter at all, not out of fear, but out of plain necessity, because a foul air seeped up from the lower levels, heavy and poisonous, the kind that kills a torch and then kills the man holding it. Whatever lay in the deepest part of the complex, they left it exactly where it was. They mapped what they could safely reach, the article said, and the rest stayed sealed behind bad air and darkness, which means that even by the story's own account, the bottom of the place was never actually seen. The deepest rooms, the oldest rooms, went unopened. And then the whole site went silent, and no one, officially, ever went back down. The article gave a second name, too. A Professor S.A. Jordan said to be leading the excavation on behalf of the Smithsonian, and it promised more. It said the work was ongoing, that the institution was actively studying the find, that revelations were coming that would rewrite the history of the American continent, and then nothing. No follow-up of any weight, no grand unveiling, no museum exhibit. The promised revelations never came. The dig, if it was a dig, closed without a sound. And when researchers in later decades went looking for the people named in the story, they hit a wall that is, in its own way, stranger than the story itself. Because the Smithsonian says it has no record of any of them. No G.E. Kincaid. No Professor S.A. Jordan. No expedition to a cavern city beneath the Grand Canyon. No artifacts logged, no field notes filed, no correspondence preserved. According to the institution, the men in the article are ghosts. They never worked there. The dig never happened. The whole thing, the official position holds, was a piece of newspaper fiction, an entertainment, the sort of tall tale a struggling paper might run to move copies on a slow week. And maybe that is all it was. That is the simple answer, and the simple answer is usually right. But the people who refuse to let this story die have always pointed at the same handful of details, and they are worth laying out, because once you see them, you cannot quite unsee them. The first is the names on the map. Go and look at the section of the Grand Canyon the article points toward, the stretch of canyon downriver in that part of Arizona. Look at what the formations there are actually called. The Tower of Set, the Tower of Ra, Horus Temple, Osiris Temple, Isis Temple, Cheops Pyramid, the Buddha Temple, the Shiva Temple. A wall of Egyptian and Asian names stamped onto the official maps of the United States. In a remote canyon where, we are told, no Egyptian or Asian civilization ever set foot. Someone named those features. Someone in an official capacity looked at that landscape and reached for the gods of the Nile and the temples of the East, and no one has ever given a clean answer as to why. The second detail is the geography of silence. That whole quarter of the canyon is restricted. Access is controlled, and it has been for a very long time. The official reasons are the ordinary ones: preservation, safety, the protection of sacred sites. All reasonable. All true, probably. But it means that the one place on Earth where you could go and check, where you could climb the cliff and find the passage or prove there was none, is the one place you are not permitted to go. And the third detail, the one that the simple answer never quite accounts for, is the Hopi themselves. Because here is the thing the debunkers tend to leave out. The 1909 article did not invent the idea of an inhabited world beneath that canyon. The Hopi had been saying it for centuries before any newspaper printed a word. The story of the underworld, the emergence, the structures below, the world that ended in water, all of that was already there, woven into the oldest tradition of the people who lived closest to the ground. The newspaperman did not have to dream up an underground city. He only had to listen to what the elders had always known and never fully told. And that is the part that should stop you cold. When the researchers and the curious came in 1909 and in the decades after, and they sat with the Hopi elders and asked them directly, plainly, what is down there, the elders did not laugh it off. They did not say, there is nothing down there, that is a foolish question. They did something stranger. They acknowledged the place was real, and then they declined to describe it. They drew the line, and they held it. Some things, they said, are not for telling. So the question stops being whether a single newspaper made up a story. The question becomes why two completely separate sources, a 1909 reporter and a 1,000-year-old oral tradition, are pointing at the same hole in the ground and describing the same impossible thing. A built world beneath the canyon that came to an end. And once you start looking, the canyon stops feeling like an exception. It starts feeling like one point in a pattern that circles the whole planet. Nearly every old culture on Earth keeps the same two stories set right next to each other. A world that came before this one, far more capable than it had any business being, and a catastrophe, almost always water, that ended it and left a small remnant to begin again. The Sumerians wrote it down. The Hebrews wrote it down. The peoples of the Andes told it, and the peoples of India, and the islanders of the Pacific, and the nations of the American plains. Different gods, different names, the same skeleton underneath every time. A high world, a flood, a handful of survivors carrying the memory forward like a candle through a storm. The official answer is that this is simply how human beings cope with disaster, that every culture invented the same flood on its own, out of the same fear of rising rivers. Maybe. But the people who follow this thread ask a sharper question. What if it keeps appearing everywhere because it actually happened everywhere, once to a single connected world, and what we file away as 100 separate myths are really 100 fragments of one eyewitness account, shattered and scattered across the languages of the survivors? Read it that way, and the Hopi are not keeping a local legend at all. They are holding their assigned piece of a global record. And their piece happens to come with an address, a canyon, a doorway, a sealed door in the dark. and that is the door through which a much larger and much stranger idea walks in. Because there is a theory that takes all of this, the cavern, the relics, the Egyptian names, the buried dead, the silence of the elders, the silence of the institution, and refuses to treat them as separate accidents. It argues they are fragments of one single fact that has been carefully sanded out of the history we are taught. The theory has a name now, borrowed from an old word that used to sprawl across the maps of Asia before it, too, quietly disappeared from them. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back, Tartaria. Stay with me, because this is where it stops being a ghost story and starts being a claim about history itself. The argument runs like this. The official story of human civilization, the one in the textbooks, is a story of slow, painful climb. Mud huts to stone, stone to brick, brick to steel, each generation a little richer and a little more capable than the last, the whole thing trending upward in a clean and flattering line. According to that story, the people who supposedly built a city of hand-cut chambers and hardened copper deep beneath the Arizona desert were primitives. They had no business doing any of it, so the find had to be a hoax because the find does not fit the line. But the theory says the line is the lie. It says there was an earlier civilization, global in its reach, that did not climb slowly at all. That it was already advanced, already connected across continents, already moving people and goods and knowledge between places we are told never touched. That its building was so far beyond what came after that we now stand in front of its work and credit it to muddy little kingdoms who, by the official timeline, could barely feed themselves. And that this earlier world did not simply decline. It was ended, wiped in an event or a series of events that the survivors and their heirs spent the next century papering over. That is the economic heart of the claim, and it is the part most people miss when they only hear about the spooky buildings. Because the deepest theft the theory describes is not a theft of stone, it is a theft of inheritance. Picture it the way you would a family. A generation builds something enormous, a fortune, a network, an infrastructure. Then catastrophe hits, the records burn, the elders die, and the children are raised to believe there was never any fortune at all, that they started with nothing, that everything they see around them was somehow built by their own poor hands in a single lifetime. They inherit the house, but they are taught they were the ones who poured the foundation. They never go looking for the will because they have been told there is no will to find. The wealth becomes orphaned. And whoever controls the story of where it came from controls everything that flows from it. The followers of the theory point at the architecture of the last few centuries and ask a single uncomfortable question. Who actually built this, and how and where did the skill go? They point at the great exposition halls and World Fair palaces that went up across America and Europe, structures of staggering scale and ornament, and then were torn down within a year or two, as if they were nothing, as if they were tents. They point at buildings with their lowest floors buried below street level, windows half sunk into the ground, and they ask why a city would build a doorway into the dirt, unless the dirt arrived later, unless something poured in and buried the first floor of a world that was already standing, a flood of mud, a reset. The theory does not stop at exposition halls either. Its followers point at the star forts, those low, geometric, many-pointed fortifications laid out with a precision that turns up in nearly identical form on 6 continents, supposedly built by separate empires that never once compared notes. They point at the cast iron and the carved ornament on great buildings that the official story credits to a single inspired architect, and a crew of labourers working mostly by hand in a couple of short years. And they ask, with real frustration, whether anyone has actually tried to reproduce that with the methods we are told were used. And they fold in one more idea, the strangest and the most quietly unsettling of the whole set. Amnesia. Not just lost records, but lost people. The claim that the population of the world was thinner than we are told, that whole regions were emptied and then quietly refilled, that the waves of orphans and unexplained migration in the last couple of centuries were a system repopulating a world it had just been forced to reset, raising a fresh generation with no memory of what came before and no reason to go looking. Whether any of that holds together is a separate question, and most of it almost certainly does not. But strip it down to the core, and the core is the same shape as the Hopi account, one more time. A high world, a reset, a new people raised inside the ruins and taught that the ruins were always theirs, that nothing came before them. The technology in the theory is modern. The bones of it are older than the country it is told in. And here, the canyon comes back into focus because the Hopi told that exact story long before anyone coined a fashionable word for it. A built world, a people living in it. And then water, ending everything, scouring the world clean so the next one could begin from the few who climbed up out of the dark. Strip the modern theory of its internet polish and its grainy old photographs, and underneath you find a flood myth, the same flood myth that the people of those mesas had been keeping quietly the whole time. So what would actually be down there in the chambers Kincaid claimed to find if any of this were more than a story? The theory has an answer, and it is the kind of answer that explains the silence. Not treasure, not gold, not jewels, nothing so easy to carry off and put behind glass. Proof. The one thing a carefully maintained version of history cannot survive contact with. A dated, layered, physical record of an advanced people on a continent where the official account allows for none. Writing on a wall in Arizona that reads like the Nile. Metalwork that should not exist for another 1,000 years. The dead of a vanished world laid in rows, each with a name no living language can pronounce. You do not need to hide that behind a lock because it is dangerous to touch. You hide it because of what it would force everyone to admit. And if that is what is down there, then suddenly every loose thread in the story pulls tight at once. The promised revelations that never came, the expedition that left no paper trail, the names that match nothing in any archive, the quarter of the canyon sealed off from the public, the Egyptian gods stamped onto an American map by official hands that never explained themselves, and the elders who looked the outsiders in the eye, confirmed the place was real, and then refused, generation after generation, to say one word more. Refusal, in that light, stops looking like superstition. It starts looking like the most disciplined act in the entire story. Everyone else either talked too much or denied everything. The Hopi did neither. They held a piece of knowledge for 1,000 years, and when the moment came that the world finally leaned in and asked, they decided the world had not earned the answer. That is not the behavior of people guarding a fairy tale. That is the behavior of people guarding a fact. And this is where the date in this story stops being a footnote and becomes the whole point. Until 1909, the silence held on both sides at once. The elders kept their counsel, and the outside world had no reason to come knocking because as far as anyone official was concerned, there was nothing under that canyon but rock and river. The two halves of the secret had never been forced into the same room. Then the article ran. And for one short stretch of weeks the two halves touched. A printed account, thick with specifics, describing the exact kind of place the Hopi had been quietly guarding for 1,000 years. For a moment it looks as if the whole thing was about to come all the way out into the daylight. The dig confirmed. The chambers opened. The tradition and the evidence finally laid side by side, where everyone could see them at last. And it was in that exact moment, with the outside world leaning in closer than it had ever leaned before, that everything clamped shut at once. The follow-up died, the names dissolved into the archives and matched nothing. The canyon stayed sealed, and the elders, who were being asked more directly in those very years than perhaps ever before, chose that of all moments to say the very least. The nearer the outside world came to the doorway, the quieter the people who knew it best became. Whatever the Hopi had always refused to say, 1909 was the year they refused hardest of all. And then the window closed, and the chance, if it ever truly was a chance, was gone. Now the careful voice in the back of your head is right to push back here, and it should. There are real and ordinary explanations for almost every piece of this, and honesty demands we put them on the table. The 1909 article has every fingerprint of a hoax, from the conveniently unverifiable names to the breathless promotional tone. The Egyptian place names in the canyon were assigned by a surveyor in the late 19th century who simply had a taste for grand mythological labels, and he handed them out across the West with a free hand. The buried lower floors of old buildings often have dull engineering reasons behind them. The exposition halls were always meant to be temporary, cheap frames dressed up to look like marble for a single summer. Each thread, pulled on its own, comes loose. But the people who cannot let this go would tell you that the trick of a good cover is never one big impossible lie. It is 1,000 small reasonable explanations, each one true enough on its own, that you are quietly discouraged from ever laying side by side. And they would say that the moment you do lay them side by side, the moment you put the cavern and the names and the silence and the sealed canyon and the 1,000-year-old flood story on the same table, the ordinary explanations stop feeling like answers and start feeling like a wall, a very smooth, very well-maintained wall, built precisely along the line where the Hopi elders always stopped talking. And to be fair to that wall, it has held for a reason. In more than 100 years, not one verified artifact from that cavern has ever surfaced. Not a single tablet, not a shard of the strange copper, not one photograph taken inside the passage Kincaid swore he walked. For a find supposedly that enormous, the physical silence is total, and total physical silence is exactly what you would expect from a story that was simply never true. Any honest telling has to set that fact in the middle of the table and leave it there. The entire case for the cavern is built almost completely out of absences. Missing records, missing names, a sealed canyon you cannot enter, a tradition that confirms the place and then will not describe it. The people who believe know this better than anyone, and their answer is unsettling for the exact reason that it can never be checked. They say the emptiness is not weak evidence of nothing. They say it is what a thorough job looks like, that you were never meant to find the proof that the absence itself is the design. Believe that, and every empty hand becomes a fingerprint. Refuse to believe it, and the whole thing folds back into an older paper quietly filling space on a slow news week. We may never know which it is. That is the honest ending and the frustrating one. The canyon keeps its quarter sealed. The institution keeps its position. The names on the map have not changed in over a century, and no one has volunteered to explain them. The article sits in the archives where anyone can read it, dismissed and impossible to fully kill, too detailed to be a simple joke, and too unsupported to be a simple fact. It hangs there, unresolved, the way the best mysteries always do. But there is one image that stays with you after the arguments wear off. It is not the cavern or the relics or the towers named for dead gods. It is an old man on a mesa, looking out at a canyon his people have watched over for longer than the country he stands in has existed. He knows the stories, he knows where the doorway is, he knows what the tradition says climbed up out of it, and what the tradition says was left behind, sealed in the dark when the water came. And a stranger with a notebook is asking him to say it out loud. He could tell the safe version, he could deny it all. Instead, he holds the line, the same line his grandfather held, and his grandfather before that. Some things are not for telling. Maybe that is fear talking. Maybe it is wisdom. Maybe it is the last thread of a record older than any of us, kept alive not in a vault or an archive, but in the deliberate unbroken silence of people who decided, 1,000 years ago, that the truth about what lies beneath that canyon was theirs to keep, and not ours to take. And until someone finally opens that sealed stretch of the canyon, and walks back the mile that Kincaid claimed to walk, the elders get the last word, the one they always chose. Nothing.